going on, guys? Welcome back to CarX Street. Today I'm going to be taking you through my entire process on how to build and tune a drift car. Now, we are going to be working with the 180SX for today, so first order of business is to get this thing looking right. Alright guys, so now that we got this thing looking good, it's time to get it over to the tuning shop and get it driving good too. Okay, so before we get started here, there are a few things that I want to mention. The first is that CarX is always working on and updating their physics, so my goal for this video isn't to throw you guys a bunch of base tune values that you can just slap on any car and have it work. My goal for this video is to help you guys understand what each value does and how you can change it to better suit your driving style. That way, if either the physics or the meta ends up changing, you guys can apply the knowledge that you learn in this video to your tunes. Now that brings me to my second point, which is that at a certain point, tuning becomes subjective. What I mean by that is once you guys get good enough, you're gonna start making your own decisions based on how you drive your car and how your cars are set up. Your tunes might look a little different from your friends or even mine, and that's okay. Just because someone makes different decisions in their tune doesn't necessarily mean they're bad or they don't know what they're doing. It might just mean that they have a different driving style from you. In fact, there's been many times where someone suggests I try something that seems absolutely crazy, I try it and I like it a lot better, so it's important to keep an open mind as we learn about these cars, these physics, and how to tune them. Now that being said, if you guys are more knowledgeable about tuning, I might say something that you disagree with. Let me know down in the comments if you do, because I might be able to learn from you guys too. I think that's pretty much everything as far as disclaimers, so we're ready to move on to step number one, which is going to be engine power and tire width. So for this build, I do have a swap in mind. I think I do want to swap over to the 2JZ, so we're going to check that out here. 130 speed coins is going to absolutely whack me, but we are going to run this engine for today. So the reason I wanted to run this engine for today is that I heard it made great power over the long run, and with just the ultimate ECU and ultimate turbo with the rest of the parts racing, we were able to make just under 600 horsepower. Now if you guys are building on a budget or looking to build a low horsepower build, don't worry, we'll go through everything for you guys as well. Everything that we talk about in today's video is going to apply to both high horsepower and low horsepower setups. For today though, I wanted to go with a little bit higher horsepower because I have been running 235s on like 3 to maybe 500 horsepower in that range, so I wanted to get a little bit higher with it, so that's why we ran the 2J. You absolutely do not have to engine swap your drift cars. My S13, my RX-7, and my Supra are all on their stock motors. Now just to show you guys real quick too, I did turn everything up in my tune, and the reason why we're starting here with our engine is because it correlates directly to our tire width. So we're gonna head over into wheels here, and next we're gonna choose our tire size, and the reason for that is the more power your car has, the easier time it's gonna have spinning the rear wheels. Now like I said guys, I have been enjoying a 235 tire width on most of my current builds. However, I haven't built one with 598 horsepower yet, so we might want to go up on that tire width depending on how the power delivery feels. We are going to be starting with that 235 though, just because it's the tire that I know and love and am currently comfortable with, and we are going to run that 18-inch wheel as well. So there it is guys, 235, 35, 18 front and rear. Now keep in mind, if you are running a lower horsepower build, you can go down to those 225s or 215s, and if you're running more power, you can go up in tire width as well. Now another factor to consider here that may influence your tire width decision is the weight of the car. The 180 is a little bit lighter, so I'm not too worried about it being heavy, but if you do end up with a heavier car, you can either go up on your tire width or lighten it up, but we'll get there when we get there. Now while we're here on wheels, there are two other measurements to consider that affect the overall size of the wheel. That's going to be our rim size and our sidewall. So our rim size or our wheel size is going to be an 18 here. That's the last number in the chain of numbers here when you choose a wheel. Typically this is a cosmetic decision for me. I like to go with what looks good on the wheel size and then adjust the sidewall accordingly, but keep in mind different size wheels are going to handle differently as well. I think the 18s look pretty good here. In fact, they might be a little bit small. That wheel well is pretty large, so we may need to go up to a 19 here, and I'll show you guys the difference here. This would be a 235/30 19, and you'll notice that second number is different as well. That's going to be our sidewall. So just for the sake of argument, say I wanted to run that 19-inch wheel, but I liked that 35 sidewall. What I can do is throw the wheel on and then head into tires and add a +5. That's going to increase the sidewall by 5. Now the sidewall adjustments definitely influence handling, so it's important to keep that in mind when you make these decisions. I personally like the stretch, and I do think a bigger sidewall on this car would be a little bit better to go back up to that 35. The 19-inch wheel looks a little big though, so I think what I'm going to do is go back to that 18. So head back into here and go back to that 18 that we already purchased, and then we're going to go into our tires and run a stretch without a plus or a minus. Obviously that's going to keep the sidewall the same. So there it is guys, front and rear. Now keep in mind, if I did go up by 5 for example, we would be increasing the overall thickness of the tire. Having a thicker sidewall allows for more tire flex and therefore slightly more grip. It also increases the overall wheel size, so you are changing the handling dynamics of the wheel depending on what sidewall you run. Obviously a thinner sidewall here is going to allow for less flex in the tire, meaning that you'll break traction easier as well. It can be tough sometimes to find the happy medium between what looks good and what feels good, so typically I end up changing this a couple times over the course of a build. We are going to be starting here though, 235, 35, 18 front and rear, and typically as a rule of thumb, I wouldn't recommend any lower than a 25 tire profile or any higher than 35. Up next, we can head into our body section here, take a look at our weight and whatnot. Now my Supra did come in around 1,300 kilograms, which I think is a pretty good weight for that car. So for right now, we're not going to weight reduce this car, but if you have something like a Mustang that's a little bit heavier and you do want to weight reduce it, this would be where you would do that. Now obviously our mind might change when we drive the car. If the car feels a little too big and too boaty, we can obviously work on that. And you guys will notice if I head into my tuning here without weight reduction, I can't change my weight distribution or center of mass in the tuning settings. Now if we throw the the elite weight reduction on here. We're gonna do it for the video so you guys can see it does open up the ability to change those tuning values. Now, typically I like to shoot for a 50-50 weight distribution, so we can bring that down a little bit, and then center of mass is good to lower as well for a more planted feel, or you can raise it if you want something that feels a little bit more floaty and boaty, but I do like to have center of mass down as a rule of thumb usually too. Now, if you're really happy with the weight of the car and you didn't want to weight reduce it, you can raise it a little bit here, but I think we'll try the 1241. We'll see how it feels, and then we'll make adjustments from there. I usually leave that fuel tank stock, guys, and I don't add any aero on my drift cars either. Now, after that, we have probably the most in-depth section of tuning. We have suspension. Typically, what I like to do is ball out a little bit in this section. I like to run ultimate everything just so that I have the maximum tuning ability available, but if you guys are looking to save some money, you can definitely run elite springs and dampers. One absolute non-negotiable for me, though, is these ultimate arms, as they do allow you the maximum steering angle possible. So we're going to throw those ultimate arms on there. We're going to do the stabilizers. Now, the stabilizer is another one that I want to talk about here. The way a stabilizer bar works is it ties the left and right side of the car together. So it is going to stiffen up the chassis feel of the car, but doesn't necessarily stiffen up the suspension. Some drivers prefer no stabilizer, which allows the left and right sides of the car to work independently from one another and creates a little bit of a softer feel, but I do on this game prefer the ultimate stabilizer, but zeroed out. So you guys will notice here, if I throw the elite stabilizer on here, for example, I'm going to once again do it for the video and head into tuning, we're not going to be able to tune our front stabilizer, so we're stuck with a value of 18. If we apply the ultimate stabilizer though and head in here, go back up to stabilizer, we can bring that down to 10. Usually 10 or 11 is the value I end up with, so we're going to apply that there. We're going to do that on both the front and the rear stabilizer. So rear stabilizer bar here as well, we'll go to ultimate, and then over here we can bottom that out, and we're going to make them even. We're going to go 10 with the rear as well. Now, after that, we have brakes. This is another controversial one. Some people like stock brakes because they believe that having the lower brake torque on the stock brakes is the most beneficial setup for their drift cars. What you'll notice though on the stock brakes, if we head back into tuning, is that it won't even let us go down to tune our brake values at all. Now, if we go over to the ultimate brakes, so head in here and apply the ultimate, now we can go down to brakes and we can tune our values. Now, if we look at braking force with the ultimate brakes, the lowest we can go is 9. If we apply the racing instead, however, and head back into tuning, we can come down here and you'll see that our lowest braking force is 8. So yes, you do get lower braking force with lower upgrades. And the reason this is good is because with lower braking force, you can left foot brake more effectively without having to be so light on the trigger. Now, I do wish there was a way to see what the brake torque was on the stock brakes. Oh, I can pull this down. Okay, cool. So we're at 7 with the stock brakes. So that's not a huge difference from 7 to 9. What you do get access to with these ultimates though is a lot more brake bias tuning, which is really beneficial as far as offloading the brake pressure from the rear axles. Now, just to explain that brake balance for you guys a little bit better, what it does is it determines how much braking force goes to either the front or the rear wheels. Higher values will send the braking force forward to the front wheels, and lower values will send the braking force to the rear wheels. Usually I'll go up as high as I can on the brake balance. Now you might be able to find a happy medium. So for example, if we throw the racing brakes on here and go back into our tuning values, we'll come down here to the brake values. You'll see that we have a little bit lower braking force at 8, but if we go to tune our brake balance, we can't go up as high as 70. It locks us out at 61. This is why it's important to experiment with different setups and find what works for you. I am going to throw those ultimates back on there though and make sure that my values are all set. Yep, looks good. And we are ready to move on to rear suspension arms. Like I said, I like to ball out with this stuff. We're going to go all ultimate for today, and then we're going to do the same for our spring. Oh, never mind. Actually, we're not going to go ultimate for today because I forgot they cost speed coins. It's another good reason to stay elite on our springs and dampers. So we're going to do that and get that all set up. Now we're ready to tune our suspension. So our first value in suspension tuning is going to be our spring length. This can basically be treated as an overall height adjustment. For now, we're not going to worry about it because you guys will see as we change the spring stiffness, the ride height will change as well. Now up next, we are going to take a look at that spring stiffness as well as our damper bump and rebound adjustments. For the most part, spring stiffness can be treated mostly as an overall stiffness adjustment for the whole suspension. Damper bump and rebound, however, are a little bit more fine-tuned. So damper bump is going to control how quickly the strut is going to compress, and damper rebound is going to control how quickly the strut is going to decompress. For all these values, higher numbers are going to mean more resistance and therefore a stiffer suspension. So for the sake of today's video, we're going to actually max out all these suspension values, bump and rebound, stiffness as well. You're going to see the front of the car raise up a little bit, and we are going to do that front and rear as well. Heading into the overworld now, you guys will see as we turn, the car is going to be really skatey and slidey as it does have a stiff suspension, and it's not going to be very compliant as we spin out immediately. You'll also notice that as we hit bumps, it's going to be very harsh and rough, although that wasn't much of a bump here. See if we can find a curb. There we go. There's a little sidewalk we can hit. So you'll see that the car is very stiff. There's not a lot of flex to the suspension at all, so when we hit a bump, the whole car moves all together. Now, obviously, having less traction isn't necessarily a bad thing in drifting as you are looking to slide the car, but you don't want to have the suspension all the way stiff because it does make the car handle worse. You want to have a little bit of give and a little bit of flex while you're driving as well. Now, heading back in here, we're going to go all the way soft, no diddy, and we're going to see what the difference is between suspension setups. Now, you guys are going to notice with that spring stiffness all the way down, our car is absolutely slammed because the spring is allowing the weight of the body to compress the strut. If you do end up with a softer suspension, what you're going to want to do is raise the spring length from there. So we're going to do that a little bit just so that the car isn't isn't completely on the ground. And you can do that once again with the spring length, which works as a height adjustment. So here it is all the way soft, and you guys are gonna notice that it's the exact opposite. The car has a ton of body roll. It looks super soft. It's like a big plate of jelly or something, or jello. You guys know what I'm talking about, the plate with the thing on it that blah, blah, blah. So now the car has a lot more grip, but it's uncontrolled in a different way. The body isn't really planted or solid in any way, and it's just kind of doing whatever it wants. This makes it harder to control the weight of the car. I'm gonna hit a couple bumps here as well for comparison. And you guys will see that the body does a better job, but it's so soft that the struts are actually bottoming out, and it's making the car hit the bumps harshly here as well. There you go. The car bounces, it flips around, it does its thing, and it's equally uncontrolled, but in a different way. So basically with the full soft suspension, you're looking at just a super sloppy setup, right? It's uncontrolled because it's sloppy, and with the stiff suspension, it's uncontrollable because it's too stiff, it's too tight, and it's not giving it all. Now for today, what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna be ripping the spring stiffness as well as the damper bump and rebound from the Super Tune, because that car honestly feels phenomenal. Obviously, this is just a starting point. We may have to make adjustments based on how this car feels, as it is a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter than the Mark IV, but it should get us in the ballpark. So that's gonna be a stiffness value of 80 in the front. 79 is going to be the closest we can get. Then we go down to damper bump and rebound, where our values are going to be 7600, 5320, 131, and 7520. Now for the rear, we were a little bit stiffer on the Supra at 95, so we'll run 94 here on this one. And our damper values are going to be 65, 36, 13, 8, and 76 as well. Now obviously that is not it for tuning suspension. Up next we have our alignment values. So we have camber, caster, Ackerman, and steering angle. We're going to take this piece by piece and talk about each value. So first up we have camber. Camber determines the angle of the wheel in relation to the ground. So you'll see if I add positive camber, the top of the wheel comes out, and if I add negative camber, the top of the wheel moves in. The way I like to think about camber is it's kind of like a hockey player stopping on the ice. If the player stands up tall, he's not going to be able to stop super well, but if he gets down really low and gets a nice angle on his skate, he's going to be able to dig into the ice and stop a little better too. It works pretty similarly here on drift cars. So when you're cornering, if you have more of an angle on your wheel, the wheel is able to bite into that corner and have a little bit more grip for you as well. Now the downside of that is it does cost a little bit of straight line speed and stability. So if you add too much camber to a car, especially a drift car, it can cause some stability issues when it comes time to transition. Now if you add too little, you might not have enough corner grip and you might be understeering or oversteering because you don't have enough camber. Typically in the front, I like to run somewhere around 7.5, so we have 7.2 here. That should be pretty good as a starting point. And then in the rear, you want to actually have less camber in the rear than you do in the front. This is going to allow the car to rotate a little better. So we're actually going to bring this up. I usually like somewhere around 2.5. And we got 2.5 on the nose, so we're going to apply that there. Now, in regards to rear camber, I have seen people run 0 or even some positive camber. This is totally viable, and I even ran a similar setup on some of my builds on CarX Drift Racing. However, on this game, I love reverse entries, and I feel like having a little bit more rear camber helps me stay in drift and keep the angle for the score multiplier. After camber, we have caster, which basically determines how forward the front wheel is going to sit in the wheel well. So if we bring that all the way forward, you're actually not going to see a difference here graphically on the car, but bringing the value up will bring the wheel forward, and moving the value down will bring the wheel back. Now, having more caster does help with something called self-steer, which basically means when you let go of the steering wheel, or if you take your thumb off the analog stick, the car will return to its center position easier. I have known some really good drivers who just, as a rule of thumb, run max caster, and that does give you a little bit more stability in a standard drift. However, I like to be down closer to 10.5 myself. This gives me just a little bit more stability in those reverse entries as well, whereas I feel like max caster, it's a little bit easier to spin out. After that, we have Ackerman angle. Now, I feel like in CarX games, Ackerman can basically be treated as a steering sensitivity slider. On controller, I like 75, and on wheel, I like to bottom it out, but this is one of those values that I recommend you guys try different values and see what works best for you. After that, we have steering angle, which is going to determine how far our wheels can turn. We want as much of that as possible for sure. And then we have wheel toe. This is one of those values for me that ends up being different in CarX from what people normally do IRL, but we have to keep in mind this is a game and it has its own physics, so different things are going to work differently from IRL to certain games, and this is one of those things that I like to be a little bit unconventional with. The way wheel toe works is it determines how far in or out the front of the wheels point on a car. A negative value is going to mean that you have toe out, meaning that the front of the wheels point outward, and a positive value is going to mean toe in, meaning that the front of the wheels point inward. Now, typically on an IRL drift car, you'll see a little bit of negative toe in the front and a little bit of positive toe in the rear. I actually flip that and run the opposite on CarX. I run a little bit of positive toe in the front and a little bit of negative on the rear. Now, I will say on the rear, you can definitely run some positive toe or toe in if that feels better for you. It's going to be a little bit slower and a little bit more stable on transitions. I personally like the negative toe on the rear a lot, though it seems to wake the car up a lot and make it easier to control. So for the front here, guys, we're going to run about 0.18 positive, and on the rear here, we're going to run 0.18 negative just as a starting point. Now, I typically wouldn't wouldn't recommend running more toe than that either way, front or rear. But once again, always feel free to experiment and let me know what you think for yourself. So with toe finished off here, guys, that is going to finish up our baseline alignment. Now, you guys will notice that my fitment and my ride height are absolutely insane. That's where spring length is going to come in. We're going to lower the front as low as we can go, I guess. Maybe tuck that tire a little bit before we're in the road. 65 looks pretty good, and then we're going to do the same in the rear. Going to bring that rear way down. The stiffness adjustment had us like absolutely jacked up, and it is going to add a little bit of visual camber, but you guys will notice that our camber adjustment, like the actual tune adjustment, stays the same. Now, our rear is bottomed out, so if we wanted to go any lower, we would have to lower from stiffness, which I'm thinking where we were a little stiffer in the rear, we may want to, yeah, we're going to go down to 62 and keep it square for now, just to get the car a little bit lower visually, because honestly, we're not even sure how it's going to drive yet. Once you have your ride height all set, you can head on into wheels here. We're going to add some spacers, ultimate front and rear, and that's going to allow us to tune our track width, or wheel offset as it's called in CarX Street. Basically what this does is it determines how wide the wheels sit in the fenders, and that is going to change the handling dynamics of the car as well. Now, typically I do like to have a little bit more width up front compared to what we have in the rear, on the same kind of philosophy as the Camber, where I like to have a little bit more grip in the front and a little bit less in the rear for rotation. Having that width up front helps your front wheels grip up too, and can even make your steering feel a little better as well. Now, some drivers are a little bit more picky with this than others, but I like to make sure that my wheels clear my fenders so they're not like bouncing through the fenders when I drive around. So obviously if I went super flush like this, right, I hit one bump and that wheel's gonna go right through the front fender. So I'm gonna move into about 9 here in the front. And honestly, the rear width doesn't look bad. So right there, I'm going through the fender. Maybe we can walk that back a little bit. So like 5.5. That looks pretty good to me as a starting point as well. All right, so now that we have our engine, our wheels, and our suspension completely figured out, we're ready to hit the overworld and see what this car looks like and drives like out there. So we're back in the daytime here. Now, the first thing I want to do is check my fitment and clearance up front. So you'll see that my tire is going through the fender a little bit. There's really no downside to this as far as handling, but I do like to have that clearing a little bit more just for the sake of visuals. So I think I'm going to raise the front of the car up just a little bit. We'll check the rears here as well. The rears are clearing just fine. So the rears are fine, but I think we're gonna wanna come up just a little bit with that front. Let's see how the ride height looks. So heading out into drone mode, we're about equal front and rear, but I think we can afford to bring that front up one click. Now, obviously, guys, with fitment, there are multiple things that we can do. I think raising it is gonna be fine, but we could lower that track width just a little bit on the spacers, or we could run a little bit more camber as well. But I think bringing up the stiffness, no, not the stiffness, the length is gonna be the move here. I think just one click will do it. It might not be enough of a jump, so we'll take a look at the front spacers as well, and maybe pull that in by a half. So we're at 8 and 5. Let's do that and see how it looks in the overworld as well. All right, so it hits a little bit. I think that's passable, at least for this video. As of right now, this thing's feeling pretty good. The alignment feels good. I feel like the spring stiffness is a little bit soft, at least in the rear. The front feels fine, but it does feel a little mushy back there in the rear. Now, this is where we can pay attention to the damper bump, right? Like, is it coming in too easily, or is it going out too easily? I feel like it might be a little sloppy overall. So we might be able to raise those damper values a little bit and leave the spring stiffness where it's at. That way we don't have to worry about our ride height adjustment either. So that should be a pretty easy fix in here. We're gonna bring up that bump. Our fast bump is already almost all the way up, so our values are actually pretty high. Maybe we do need to bring that stiffness up just a little bit. Actually, that makes sense because we were way higher before. And then we can, oh, our spring length is all the way down, which honestly doesn't look quite as tough, but might work out a little bit better as far as being equal with our front fitment. So I think that looks pretty good there. Let's try that. Yeah, so that feels a lot better already. The car's not so sloppy in the rear, nice and solid, nice and planted, and still has a little bit of give when you really hit a little bit of body roll there. So that's kind of how I tune suspension. You just gotta feel it out, guys. Drive the car around a little bit and really feel what works for you. The fronts, honestly, if anything, feel maybe a little stiff, but the alignment feels phenomenal. And I think in order to really feel out those fronts, we're gonna wanna hit a bump. Hit this here. No, I think it feels pretty good. The fronts feel pretty good. Rears feel good now too. Just hit that bump there and was able to keep grip pretty well. Now, as you guys just saw, we bogged out pretty bad there. So our next step here is gonna be transmission and gearing. The power feels phenomenal. Honestly, the tires feel pretty good too. It rotated pretty easily there. Actually, before we go into transmission, let's make sure we have enough tire on this thing. We'll throw a couple backies. It is going around easily, so you gotta be a little bit more careful on the 235s with like 600 horsepower. We could go to a 245. See, it just throws it around. All right, so we're figuring it out. We have a little bit more power on these tires, but I don't think it's so bad that we're gonna need to go up in tire size. Although it is kind of going, let's, you know what? Just for the sake of it, it's gonna throw our fitment off, but let's throw a 245 on here just to see, so that way you guys can, we'll go to a 255. We'll go way thicker so you guys can see the difference. All right, so 255 in the front, 255 in the rear. Let's drift this and see how it does. Yeah, it's still going around. So that's gotta be an alignment issue, right? So if changing the tire width doesn't make it any better, then we can chalk that up to alignment. We may need to adjust our toe or our camber in some way, and that's kind of more for the fine tuning stage though. So we're gonna head back in here, throw our 235s back on because they looked amazing. Sorry for the little side quest here, guys. Got super distracted with the wheel size, but this is the nuance in tuning. And by the way, if you guys have any questions about specifics on these tuning setups, definitely let me know down in the comments below. I'm happy to help. So we're gonna head back in with our 235s here, looking good. Now we're gonna get back out into the overworld and we're gonna pay closer attention to our gearing. In fact, I think we should choose now if we want to swap out our transmission to something with a 6-speed. I typically do like having 6 gears available. I've spent so much street going on this car, it's insane. Let's do it. Now within transmission, we have a couple parts to upgrade here. We're gonna go with that ultimate clutch. Differential we'll get to in a second. We're gonna go with that ultimate gearbox, and we are gonna leave the rear wheel drive drivetrain. Now for diff, a lot of people prefer welded as that's what you see in most real life drift cars. However, on CarX, I prefer the ultimate, and I'm gonna explain the differences as best I can. Basically what the differential does in a drift car is it determines the rate at which the rear wheels spin together. A welded diff is gonna be full lock all the time, meaning that your left and right rear wheels will always be spinning together. This is typically the move for IRL drifters, as having those rear wheels locked together does help you break traction easier and initiate a slide. In CarX, however, I do like to have a little bit more control over what the diff is doing. Now when you go with the ultimate differential, you unlock access to tuning your acceleration lock, coast lock, and your preload. Acceleration lock is going to determine how locked up your wheels are while you're accelerating, and coast lock is going to do the opposite. It's going to determine how locked up your wheels are while you're off your throttle. Typically, I do like to have my acceleration lock up a little higher, somewhere around 1.3, with my coast lock somewhere around 0.8. This locks the rear wheels up together a little bit more while I'm accelerating, but does allow the car to grip up a little bit more when I'm off throttle. Now, as with anything, guys, this is absolutely preferential. If you guys feel like you're gripping up too much when you're off the gas, you can raise that coast lock, or you can move over to a welded diff. In my experience, though, that welded diff is a little bit unpredictable, especially on transitions where the rear wheels are always locked together, so there's no give in the differential to allow it to grip up in different circumstances. Preload essentially works as an aggressiveness slider for the differential, how fast that power comes on, so I like to have it somewhere around a quarter of the way up, but that can change dependent on the car. Now heading back over to the other side in our transmission settings, we do have gear shifting speed here as a result of that ultimate clutch, which we can bring all the way down. Obviously, the quicker shifts, the better. And then we have transmission losses too, which we can bring all the way down as well. Now after that, we have gearing, which we're gonna need to drive the car a little bit and take some notes on how the transmission feels, and then we can make adjustments to our gearing as a whole. All right, so driving the 6-speed for the first time here, the purpose of first gear is basically to get the car going, and I'm noticing that the car redlines super easily here. So once again, we'll go from a launch first, redline second, just immediately third, and then fourth starts to grip up and hook up a little bit. So basically what that's telling me is that the gear ratios as a whole can be much longer, so we're gonna end up adjusting our final drive first. So heading back into the tuning shop here, guys, we're gonna start working on our gearing now. The way the gearing works is that final drive is kind of like an overall setting for all the gears, and then obviously you can adjust first through sixth as well individually, and reverse in this game, which is pretty cool. So with gearing, a lower number means that the gears are gonna get longer, meaning that it's gonna take a longer amount of time for the RPMs to build and for your engine to redline. Where I'm looking for longer gears overall, we are gonna lower that final drive to start, and then we're gonna make adjustments from there. So with that final drive lengthened, it should be a little longer, so third's taking a little bit more grip now. Although I will say first and second are still pretty short. Yeah, so third feels pretty solid. I feel like first and second need to be longer. Let's get up into fourth and see how fourth feels. I think fourth could probably be a little bit shorter as well. So what I like to do at this point, so say we have third gear that's working really well, right? We're gonna see exactly where the power feels right and not too low where the car's bogging out. So I'm keeping an eye on my RPMs right now, and it feels like around 6.5 is about where the power feels like it's a little bit too low and a little too sluggish, maybe 6K, but we gotta keep in mind we have a little bit lower of a red line here too on this 2J swap. So yeah, it feels like 6 is about where I want the power to come on. Any lower than that, I feel like the car's gonna bog out, right? So if I go into fourth, right, like I bring third around here, bring it to red line, and I shift into fourth and I hit sixth, it feels pretty good. If I'm in third though, and I shift early and fourth comes on down into like 4 and 5K, it feels like it's a little low on power. So that's what I'm gonna gear the car to avoid, right? I want the car always shifting around that 6K range, and we are gonna use third as kind of like a barometer for now, like our starting point, and then we'll move on from there. So once again, up to red line, fourth still dogs out a little bit. We're gonna red line third again, fourth goes a little bit lower than 6, so I think we can shorten fourth, and then we'll do the rest of them from there. So first and second definitely need to be longer because they're redlining too easily. Third gear's fine. Fourth gear though, we're gonna want a little bit shorter, and then fifth and sixth will probably need to be a little shorter as well. So trying that out, first being longer definitely feels good, second as well, and then up into third. Second and third are a little close, so that's another gearing issue you may run into, right? So I'm at second, right? I'm drifting around in second, it feels good, and then I shift into third, and it shifts up to like almost 7K and red line's really quick. So now I'm gonna ask myself, do I wanna shorten second, or do I wanna lengthen third, right? And the way I'm gonna answer that is typically I like second to work for me at lower speeds, right? Something like this, where I'm really kind of working that brake, brake, going real slow, super tight, and honestly, it feels fine. It's really not wanting for, it could be a little shorter. See how it comes out of first too. Yeah, it is, well, first gets us going and then second just kind of redlines quickly too. There's just so much power in this car. And this is the reason why, like, I can't just take the gearing right out of the Supra, right? That car had a different amount of power, so if I just took the gears from that car, it's gonna be geared too short for a car that makes more power. And this really is the process of gearing a car. You just gotta drive it and kind of like fine tune it and massage it and work until it doesn't feel like crap. But I don't want to bore you guys too much with transmission tuning. That's the basic concept. If any gear is bogging out for you, you're gonna want to shorten it, and if any gear is redlining too easily, you're gonna want to lengthen it as well. For transmission tuning, you just have to drive the car, feel it out, and find what feels best for you as you adjust as you go. At this point, usually I would honestly recommend you guys take a break, walk away from the car for a little bit, and come back with a fresh mind for all of your fine tuning. This is a really good baseline setup, but we have been at this. The recording's 2 hours long, so obviously we're not as fresh on this as when we started, so it's always a great idea to take a break, walk away, come back to it, and do your fine tuning after. All right, guys, so we are back after a pretty good amount of fine tuning here. Gonna throw a nice big backy, and that was the thing that we were struggling most with when it came to tuning this car. It was definitely struggling at those higher angles. It was kind of snapping around a little too easily, so I did end up softening the suspension as well as opening up that rear diff a little bit, both acceleration and coast lock, just to create a little bit more grip there. We got he goes nothing on our door. He's gonna pass. Oh, nope, he's not gonna pass. And we did leave one final tuning aspect, kind of best for last. It's usually the thing that I like to adjust last, and that is gonna be tire pressure. So last but not least, for tuning here, we do have our tire pressure. Now you guys are gonna notice I actually have pretty low pressure in the front and pretty high pressure in the rear. Typically my tire pressure values do end up being a little bit closer in value to one another than what it is here, but this car in particular was really tough to get down. So you'll notice that my tire pressure in the front is much lower than the rear, and that's to create more front grip. When I was at high angle, the car was spinning around because the front tires didn't have enough grip to settle the car. Lowering the tire pressure softens the tire, and much like having a larger sidewall where there's more flex, lower tire pressure is gonna have a similar effect. Typically I do adjust my tire pressure last because it is a super effective way of changing your grip, and I do feel like if you can get your suspension and alignment settings right first, your tire pressure is really gonna be the icing on the cake, and you're not gonna be relying on it as much to get your car feeling right. Now you'll probably notice that I am running a different offset here than before as well, and we did make a whole bunch of changes to this tune. That's just kind of the nature of tuning a drift car. Like I said at the beginning of the video, guys, my purpose for this video isn't to throw you guys a set of base tune values that you can just slap on any car to have it work. It's better to understand what each value does, so if you get a weird car like this that doesn't want to settle down, you'll be able to change it as you go. Now I don't even think I'd call this car done yet. It's super solid in tandems, it 360s really well, and it does backies really well, but it's still struggling with the reverse 360, so I'll probably even do a third iteration of the tune before I release it for you guys. And once again, that's just the nature of tuning. You gotta learn the car, you gotta learn how to tune, and you gotta learn how to apply that tuning to each car. I personally find it super rewarding though when you finally get the car driving right, and I really think this thing's super close. So guys, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you guys a ton. Like I said earlier in the video, guys, if you have any questions on any of this stuff at all, feel free to let me know down in the comments and I'll help you guys out as best I can. Make sure to leave a like as well if you did enjoy the video or found it useful at all. Subscribe for more just like it, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.